Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lesson 37, Lecture 1, where we are going to talk about early Christianity and how Roman history is shaped by it, and how, in terms, Roman history shapes the evolution of early Christianity. And you might recall that earlier we discussed that, in fact, early evidence for Jesus, who we pretty much all agree was a historical figure, is very hard to find and is very much tainted by the desire to find sort of contemporary evidence from Jesus's life. For example, the Shroud of Turin here on the left supposedly put on Jesus's body after he died, but that in reality, a sort of first solid depiction, reliable historically speaking, of Jesus is not for about 200 years after that date, which is this healing of the paralytic, which comes from Dreiorpus in Syria. And it shows us the miracle of Jesus helping a paralytic person be able to walk and take away his bed on his back. Now, if we try to understand early Christianity, there are a few sort of basic things that, as a historian, you might want to think about. And number one is that Christianity, of course, grew out of a varied Jewish context. Jesus self-identified as a Jew, and in fact, quite a bit of the first century history of Judaism is very rich in figuring out the relationship between those who were self-identifying as Jewish and those who sort of increasingly moved to something somewhat different. But I think that it is helpful to think about sort of the first century of the Roman Empire, the first century CE, in which different groups, and certainly not just Christians, were expecting a Messiah to come. And they were also expecting the end of the world, the apocalypse, to come. And so quite a bit of the first century is spent with these thoughts. And I think it's sort of an important element of the development of early Christianity itself. And this is how it is sort of shaped by Roman history, is that as, other than Jesus, no other Messiah comes. Or not succeeds quite as much as Jesus does, and that there is no apocalypse, even though there's quite a bit of expectations about that. Increasingly, Christianity starts to evolve into something that is about more than those apocalyptic expectations, however much they were of interest in the first century. Now, to understand early Christianity, the other thought that's important is that, in fact, Jesus' his death, dated vaguely to 30 CE, sort of did not end the movement, the Jesus movement that evolved from his life. And a key figure in this development after Jesus' death is the Apostle Paul, who comes to Rome at a certain point, and he is also someone who travels around in the Eastern Mediterranean, as shown on this map, reaches out to different communities, and it plays a key role both in finding more potential Christians and also shaping the message. So, there is a very influential PBS documentary called From Jesus to Christ, which I also highly recommend. And in that it's very clear that, the Jesus movement evolves under the leadership of Paul and then future other figures. Paul is, of course, only one of the apostles whose memory is retained in the Christian tradition, with various locations reaching from Spain to India, where these students and acquaintances of Jesus would have worked. So if that's how the first century is spent, the second century shows even more evolution and further reach from in our historical evidence. And you can see already sort of Germany and France, and definitely North Africa, in addition to the eastern part of the Mediterranean, where Christian communities gather. Now, I think it's helpful for us to think about why it is that eventually the Christian message becomes problematic for the Romans, because as a matter of fact, in this empire that reached, from Syria to Britain, there were quite a few local deities worshipped, and most of the time the Romans didn't truly care that much about it. Like if it seemed like an old tradition, they were often like, well, you do that. They didn't feel in any way that they need to interfere with that. And so I think it's important to sort of think about sort of how the conflict evolves between pagans and Christians, although I would like to say actually that the word pagan is not historically accurate yet for this period. It's going to be later on, close to the late 3rd and 4th centuries, when it's going to become a derogatory term used by Christians to describe those who are non-Christians and non-Jews. But in this period, actually, what we should probably say is the evolution of conflicts between Romans and Christians. So the early Roman view of Christians was initially, that's just another group of Jews. There were quite a few Jewish sects considered in the context of the first Jewish revolt. And so there was a variety of Judaism available at the time. I think in order to understand why the conflict evolves, it's helpful to look at a few aspects of Christianity that become very problematic for the Romans. So, for example, first on this list is Christian apocalyptic expectations. This is the hope that the world will end. Now, that essentially looked forward to the destruction of the whole world, including Rome and the Roman emperor and everybody, the whole Roman system of government and culture and society. And so that is why we often get these descriptions about the Christians that they are hating the human race or something like that in our Latin and Greek sources, suggesting that their perception is from outside is that they must hate this world if they are waiting for it to be over. Secondly, Christian associations looked very much like certain gatherings that happen in regular Roman society. The collegia were various associations. It can be professional. It could be, there were also some other different kind of associations. Funerary associations were very popular in this period, where people gathered together and put in money every month to make sure that they would be buried when they died. But the Romans were usually just a little bit finicky about how to think about such gatherings, because what their worry always was, could this create some kind of revolt or some kind of social upheaval? So they were really trying to avoid that. And so the Romans often ban associations, and they just don't fully sort of understand why the Christians would still want to gather, even if they know that associations are banned. Thirdly, Christian monotheism is, of course, the belief in one God is something that goes very much against the demands of the imperial cult. You're supposed to consider the emperor and his family members, as well as a number of former emperors, as divine figures, which is, of course, doesn't go down so well for Christians, a huge source of conflict. And ultimately, the Christian worldview endorsed a city of God above all, even above the state as it was, the Roman state, which ultimately challenged, the whole system of Roman government. But what's important to note, nevertheless, about the Romans is that the persecutions, to the extent they could be even called persecutions in the earliest stage, were certainly not systematic or empire-wide. So Nero's example at the time of Rome's burning in 64 is a very good example of this, that they just become the scapegoats. But it's not like they're going after, they are not really going far beyond the boundaries of Rome. They are not really doing a knocking on every door type of situation and checking for if anybody there is a Christian. So this is a local and temporary persecution of Christians. There is some other sort of local persecutions under the Emperor Domitian, but I think it's also helpful to think about some limitations on how much they might want to persecute. And I should say that in a moment, we're going to talk more about that in the context of imperial policy as revealed by Trajan and Pliny's correspondence. But before I do that, I just wanted to give you an image here which survives from the 3rd century CE. And if you can make out what this is a graffito, which is a technical term for something that is scratched into plaster. And in fact, this is something that was scratched into plaster on the Palatine Hill in a house. And what you see there is you see a figure that seems to be kind of on a cross, with the exception that it has an ass's head. And here is this guy who is sort of raising his hand up, which is sort of addressing or looking or maybe even praying to this figure. And what the text says, rather surprisingly, in ancient Greek, not Latin, is Alexamenos sebeti theon. Alexamenos is a name, a Greek-sounding name, incidentally, worships his God. And obviously this is a mean depiction. This is a satire. This is inappropriate from a Christian perspective. But I think this is the kind of mocking that might have evolved in society. And it sort of gives us a bit of visual evidence for the kind of language we get in our more literary sources that talk about sort of that the Christians are haters of humankind. So this would be sort of a more popular type of depiction by someone who can write, but nevertheless someone who does not think Christianity makes any sense, clearly who would want to worship an ass-headed God. So I think this is interesting for us because we see that Christianity develops in response to this. So we see how Christians in the 1st century are sort of occasionally mentioned when they are accused. But in 110, we have this sort of interesting moment when Pliny the Younger, the same one who wrote the letter about the eruption of the Vesuvius, exchanges letters when he is a governor in what is modern-day Turkey with Trajan on what to do when he gets some Christians reported to him. And so essentially Pliny says, hey boss, emperor, what should I do when this happens? And this is what Trajan has to say to Pliny. You observe proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those who had been denounced to you as Christians, for it is not possible to lay down any general rule to serve as a kind of fixed standard. This is a very important sentence, right? There's no general policy at this point, no systematic policy against the Christians. But then Trajan continues, they are not to be sought out. If they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished, with this reservation, that whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves it, that is by worshiping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon through repentance. That is, this is the policy. We are not going to knock on every door. If you, as long as you are willing to sacrifice to our gods, or even just do a libation, then you're fine. You know, then repentance and you're completely fine. And then Trajan even continues one further, but anonymously posted accusations ought to have no place in any prosecution, which is, by the way, what happened, right? Pliny got an anonymous letter reporting some people as Christians. But this is what Trajan has to say, for this is both a dangerous kind of precedent and out of keeping with the spirit of our age. So what this suggests is that we still get a sense that the Romans are, you know, I'm not going to go after everybody and ask them extreme details about what they think. You know, if somebody is reported to us by someone who is named, so no anonymous reports, so somebody gets reported, then we might ask them, but we are not going to go door to door and seek Christians. So things change after 110 a little bit. And I think it's helpful to sort of imagine this as partially a response to the growing number of Christians by the middle of the 2nd century. And in the 160s, as this prosecution starts to evolve, is the first time that we start to get stories about individuals who become martyrs, which is a very important word for us that we're going to explore in a moment. But it's really not until the 3rd century that we will see more. The first possible law against conversion to Christianity is not until 202, which is around the time when the narrative you have read for today's class, and we're going to discuss further in the next lecture, is Perpetua and Felicity are martyred in Carthage. So that's when we are starting to get the martyr story building up. And the first systematic persecution of Christians will not occur until the middle of the 3rd century under the Emperor Decius. And so I think what's maybe the takeaway from this is that the systematic persecution is quite late. and that in fact, what I say here about the different kinds of early Christian groups, like for example, there is a sort of figurehead, Marcion, who talks about sort of how to be different from the Jews. But there we also have ecstatic prophecy, followers of another figurehead called Montanus, or we have sort of a completely different group, usually known as the Gnostics, who base their salvation on knowledge. And so I think maybe as a last step here, as an important comparison, it's helpful for us to look at the Stoics and the Christians. And I think it might even be helpful for you to think about that these are sort of connected to some extent, because both Seneca, the Stoic, and the Christians say that adversity is to be taken as a way to sharpen one's virtue, right? So the Christians will actually end up using their adversity and their increasing adversity as a tool in becoming a better Christian, right? It will become part of Christian identity, in contrast to the Stoics, for whom this was more a matter of maybe politics on the Roman emperors. And for Seneca, the wise person can tackle whatever the world throws at her with equanimity, precisely because she understands how the universe works, right? So it was like a brain job, right? Like, I understand how the world works and I know what to worry about, so I will be able to deal with whatever comes my way. Versus the Christians will not necessarily have, with some exceptions, for example, the Gnostics, but they still have a sense of the fundamental mystery about God's plans. It's not like you really have to do that understanding job. Versus, again, for Seneca, the wise person already has the only thing that matters, her virtue, versus the Christian is seeking what he lacks most and foremost and can be provided only by God, and that is salvation. So there's a difference in that. Christian virtue is very important, but there's also this very heavy focus in posthumous salvation, which is not part of the Stoic message. Nevertheless, this posthumous salvation upon death is very critical in understanding early Christian martyrdom, which is the topic of our next lecture.